What if I told you one of hip-hop's most controversial prison cases might not be what you think, and everything you've been hearing online could be completely misleading? For years, the name C Murder has been surrounded by one question: did the system get it right? Or did it lock up the wrong man? But now, suddenly, headlines are exploding across the internet claiming he's finally been released, claiming new evidence has proven his innocence, claiming the truth has finally come out after more than 2 decades. But here's where things get serious, because not everything being said is actually true. This case isn't just about a rapper. It's about a 16-year-old boy who lost his life. It's about a courtroom verdict that didn't even require all jurors to agree. It's about witnesses who later said they were pressured to lie. And it's about a legal system that many people believe failed to deliver real justice. You've got celebrities like Kim Kardashian stepping in, high-profile attorneys getting involved, and fans demanding answers. At the same time, the victim's family is still fighting to keep the conviction in place, saying the truth has already been decided. So now the internet is split right down the middle. One side is saying this is one of the biggest wrongful conviction cases in hip-hop history. The other side is saying this is a dangerous narrative that ignores a real victim. And right in the middle of all this noise is the truth. Because the real story isn't just about whether C Murder is innocent or guilty. The real story is about what actually happened, what the courts have said, and why, despite everything you're hearing right now, he is still behind bars. And once you hear the full breakdown, your opinion might completely change. Before the headlines, before the courtroom drama, and long before his name became tied to one of the most debated cases in hip-hop, C Murder was on a completely different path, one that looked like it was built for success. Born Corey Miller in New Orleans, he came up in one of the toughest environments in the country, the Calliope Projects, where survival alone was an achievement. But his story wasn't just about struggle, it was also about opportunity, because his older brother, Master P, was quietly building something that would change hip-hop forever. What started as a small record store turned into No Limit Records, a powerhouse label that dominated the late 90s, and C Murder was right at the center of it. Well, this wasn't just luck, this was timing, talent, and a machine behind him that knew exactly how to push artists into the spotlight. At his peak, C Murder wasn't just Master P's brother. He was a star in his own right. His debut album, Life or Death, hit the charts hard, going platinum and proving he could stand alone. Then came Bossolini, followed by Trapped in Crime. 3 albums, all successful, all reinforcing his place in the rap game. He was part of the group True, alongside his brothers, dropping music that reflected both the street reality he came from and the larger-than-life persona No Limit was known for. And what most people don't even realize is that before all of this, he served in the US Army as a combat medic during the Gulf War, a detail that completely changes how you see his background. This wasn't just a rapper chasing fame, this was someone who had lived multiple lives before even stepping into the booth. But that's what makes what happened next hit even harder. Because at the exact moment his career was solidified, when everything seemed to be locked in for long-term success, one night changed everything, and not just for him, but for another family whose life would never be the same again. January 12th, 2002. That's the date everything shifted, and what happened that night inside a Louisiana nightclub would set off a chain reaction that's still being debated more than 20 years later. C Murder was at the Platinum Club in Harvey, just outside New Orleans. A packed venue, loud music, energy high, the kind of environment where things can turn in seconds. And that's exactly what happened. A fight reportedly broke out in the crowd, tension escalated, and then suddenly, gunshots. In the chaos, a 16-year-old fan named Steve Thomas was shot and killed. Just like that, a night that was supposed to be entertainment turned into a tragedy, and within hours, everything started pointing toward one person. From the beginning, the case against C Murder moved fast, but what made it unusual was what it didn't have. There was no weapon recovered, no DNA evidence tying him to the shooting, no surveillance footage capturing the moment, and no confession. Instead, the entire case rested almost entirely on eyewitness testimony, specifically 2 men who claimed they saw him pull the trigger. That was it. 2 witnesses, no physical evidence, and a high-profile defendant already known to the public. And in a situation like that, her perception becomes powerful because when a celebrity is involved, the spotlight doesn't just shine, it magnifies everything. But here's where things start to get complicated. Nightclub environments are chaotic, loud, and confusing. People are moving, lights are flashing, emotions are high. So how reliable are eyewitness accounts in a situation like that? That question would become one of the biggest points of debate in this entire case. Because while prosecutors leaned heavily on those testimonies to build their argument, the defense would later argue that those same witnesses weren't as solid as they seemed. And as the case moved forward, cracks would begin to show, cracks that would eventually turn this from a straightforward conviction into one of the most controversial legal battles in hip-hop history. When C. Murder finally went to trial, what should have been a clear path to justice quickly turned into something far more controversial. Because the deeper you look at how this case was handled, the more questions start to appear. The prosecution built its entire argument around those 2 eyewitnesses who claimed they saw him pull the trigger, and without physical evidence, their words became the foundation of everything. At first, that seemed enough. Jurors heard the testimony, weighed the situation, and in 2003, he was convicted. But that conviction didn't last, because the court later discovered something serious. Prosecutors had failed to disclose key information about their witnesses, including details about their criminal backgrounds. That's not a small mistake. That's a major violation. And it led to the conviction being overturned and a new trial being ordered. Now you would think a second trial would clear things up, but instead, it made things even more complicated. By the time the retrial happened in 2009, the pressure around the case had only grown. The victim's family wanted justice, the public was watching closely, and the courtroom atmosphere was intense. Once again, the prosecution leaned heavily on witness testimony, and once again, the defense pointed out the lack of physical evidence. But the most shocking part came when the jury began deliberating. They couldn't agree. The jury was deadlocked, meaning not everyone believed he was guilty. And in most places in the United States, that would have resulted in a mistrial. But Louisiana was different at the time. Instead of requiring all jurors to agree, the law allowed a conviction with a non-unanimous verdict. So even though 2 jurors believed he was not guilty, it didn't matter. The final verdict came back 10-2, guilty. And just like that, C. Murder was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Think about that for a second. A man's entire life decided without full agreement in the jury room. And it didn't stop there. Later, one of those jurors would come forward claiming that pressure inside the deliberation room was so intense that it affected the outcome. That detail alone turned this case from controversial into something people started calling deeply flawed. Just when it seemed like the case against C. Murder was sealed, years later something happened that completely shook public perception. The very witnesses who helped convict him started to walk their statements back. And this wasn't small clarification or confusion, this was full recantation. One of the key witnesses came forward and claimed that his original testimony wasn't true, saying he had been pressured by law enforcement to identify C. Murder as the shooter or risk facing serious charges himself. Think about how serious that is, because if that claim is true, it means the foundation of the entire case wasn't just weak. It may have been manipulated. And it didn't stop with one witness. The second key eyewitness also expressed doubts about his original testimony, later stating that he was not certain C. Murder was the shooter. Now suddenly the 2 voices that carried the prosecution's case were no longer solid. Instead of certainty, there was confusion. Instead of confidence, there were contradictions. And this is where the story really takes a turn, because in most situations, when key witnesses recant, especially in a case with no physical evidence, it can open the door for a new trial. But here's the twist. The courts didn't see it that way. Judges looked at these recantations and called them unreliable, pointing out inconsistencies in the new statements and questioning why the witnesses waited years to speak out. From a legal standpoint, recanting testimony is often treated with skepticism, because courts assume that what was said under oath during trial carries more weight than statements made later. So even though the public started to question everything, legally, nothing changed. No retrial, no release, no reversal. And that's what makes this case so frustrating to so many people, because you now have a situation where the original testimony is being challenged by the same people who gave it, yet the conviction still stands. It leaves one massive question hanging in the air. If the witnesses themselves are no longer sure, then what exactly is this conviction still built on? Just when it seemed like there might finally be a turning point for C murder, something major happened in the US legal system. Something that directly connected to his case and gave supporters real hope. In 2020, the United States Supreme Court made a landmark decision that changed how criminal trials work across the country. The ruling declared that non-unanimous jury verdicts, like the 10-2 decision that convicted C murder, are unconstitutional. In simple terms, from that moment forward, every juror must agree in order to convict someone of a serious crime. No more split decisions, no more partial agreement. It has to be unanimous. Now think about what that means in the context of his case. 2 jurors in C murder's trial believed he was not guilty. Under today's law, that alone would have prevented a conviction. The trial would have ended in a hung jury, and the entire process would have had to start over. For supporters, this felt like confirmation of what they had been saying for years, that his conviction didn't meet the standard of true justice. Even high-profile voices like Kim Kardashian spoke out, pointing directly to this issue as a reason his case deserved another look. But here's where hope turned into frustration. And the Supreme Court later ruled that this new law would not apply retroactively to cases that had already been finalized. That means even though the system admitted that non-unanimous verdicts are unconstitutional, it refused to go back and fix past cases built on that same rule. And because C murder had already exhausted his appeals, the decision couldn't help him. So now you have a situation that feels almost impossible to ignore. A man is serving life in prison based on a type of verdict that is now considered unconstitutional. And yet, legally, nothing changes for him. That's the contradiction at the heart of this case. And it's exactly why people are still fighting, still debating, and still asking whether justice here was ever truly served. As the legal doors continued to close for C murder, something else started to open: public pressure, and not just from fans, but from some of the most influential names in entertainment and law. This wasn't just a quiet case buried in court documents anymore. It became a movement. One of the biggest voices pushing for his release has been Kim Kardashian, who has built a reputation in recent years for advocating in criminal justice reform cases. She didn't just mention his name, she laid out details, highlighted the non-unanimous jury issue, pointed to the recanted witness statements, and argued that he deserves a new trial. And when someone with that level of reach speaks, people listen. But she wasn't alone. High-profile civil rights attorney Ben Crump joined the case as well, someone known for taking on cases involving systemic injustice. When a lawyer like that steps in, it signals that there are serious concerns about how the case was handled. At the same time, singer Monica, who has a personal connection to C murder, has been one of the most consistent voices advocating for his freedom, keeping his name in conversations year after year, refusing to let the case fade away. And then there's family. Because behind all the headlines, this is still a family fighting for one of their own. Master P has spoken publicly about his brother's situation multiple times, even revealing that at one point there may have been a plea deal on the table, reportedly around 8 years, that could have brought him home long ago. But C. Murder chose not to take it, standing on his innocence instead. And that decision changed everything, because now, instead of serving a limited sentence, he's spent over 2 decades behind bars with no clear end in sight. So while the courts have said no, the conversation outside the courtroom has only gotten louder. And with more attention comes more pressure. But the real question is, will that pressure ever be enough to actually change the outcome? Despite all the attention, all the advocacy, and all the new arguments being presented, the reality for C. Murder remains the same. Every major legal attempt to overturn his conviction has been denied. Over the years, his legal team has filed multiple appeals, each one centered around the same core issues: the recanted witness testimony, the lack of physical evidence, and the controversial 10-2 jury verdict. On paper, those points sound strong enough to at least warrant a new trial. But in practice, the courts have consistently ruled otherwise. And one of the biggest setbacks came when federal appeals courts reviewed his case and concluded that he had not shown enough evidence of a constitutional violation to justify reopening it. That decision alone closed one of the most important legal paths available to him. Then, more recently, the Louisiana Supreme Court, every single justice, declined to even hear his latest appeal. Not denied after review, refused to hear it at all. And that sends a very clear message from the legal system. As far as the courts are concerned, this case is settled. And that's what makes this situation so difficult to process. Because outside the courtroom, the narrative is still evolving. People are debating, questioning, and demanding answers. But inside the legal system, the door is almost completely shut. The standards for reopening a case are extremely high, especially after so many years, and recanted testimony alone, no matter how dramatic, often isn't enough to meet that threshold. So now the fight has shifted. Instead of relying solely on appeals, the focus has turned toward alternative paths. Things like clemency, where a governor could step in and reduce or overturn the sentence, or other extraordinary legal remedies that rarely succeed but still exist as a possibility. But those paths are uncertain, unpredictable, and heavily influenced by factors beyond just the facts of the case. Which brings us to the harsh reality, because no matter how many headlines claim otherwise, no matter how many people believe he's innocent, as of right now, C. Murder is still serving a life sentence. Now here's where everything really needs to be separated, because the internet is telling one story, and reality is telling another. Right now, if you scroll through social media, you'll see headlines claiming that C. Murder has been released, that new evidence has proven his innocence, that the case is finally over. But none of that has actually happened. As of now, he is still in prison, still serving a life sentence, and no court has officially overturned his conviction. That's not opinion. That's fact. And this gap between what people believe is happening and what is actually happening is what keeps this case so confusing and so controversial. The truth is, there are elements of this case that raise serious questions: the recanted witnesses, the lack of physical evidence, the non-unanimous jury verdict that would not be allowed today. Those are real issues, and they're the reasons so many people, including high-profile figures like Kim Kardashian, continue to push for another look at the case. But in a courtroom, belief isn't enough. Evidence has to meet a very strict legal standard, and so far, every judge who has reviewed the new claims has decided they don't meet that standard. At the same time, there's another side to this story that often gets lost in viral headlines: the victim. A 16-year-old lost his life that night, and his family has spent more than 2 decades living with that reality. For them, this isn't about debates or theories. It's about justice already being served. And every time the case trends again, Every time someone claims C. Murder is innocent or about to be released, it reopens wounds that never fully healed. So now you're left with two powerful narratives colliding. One says this is a wrongful conviction that needs to be corrected. The other says the system got it right, and the verdict should stand. And until something changes legally, both sides are going to keep fighting to be heard. So after everything, the rise, the crime, the trial, the recanted witnesses, the legal twists, and the years of appeals, we're left with one question that still doesn't have a clear answer. What really happened that night? And did the system truly get it right with C. Murder? Because this isn't one of those cases where everything lines up neatly. Instead, it sits in that uncomfortable grey area where both sides have arguments that feel real. On one hand, you have a conviction based largely on eyewitness testimony with no physical evidence, and those same witnesses later saying they were pressured. You have a jury verdict that wouldn't even be allowed under today's law. You have a juror claiming pressure inside the deliberation room. All of that makes people question whether justice was fully served. But on the other hand, the courts, at every level, have reviewed these arguments and still upheld the conviction. And there's also a family who lost a 16-year-old son, a life that can't be brought back, no matter what happens next. That reality doesn't change, regardless of new claims or shifting public opinion. And that's what makes this case so powerful, because it forces you to think beyond headlines. Is this a story about a flawed system that failed to correct itself? Or is this a case where the legal process worked exactly the way it was supposed to, even if people don't agree with the outcome? Right now, the truth is simple. C. Murder has not been released, and no court has officially proven his innocence. But the conversation is far from over. His legal team is still fighting, supporters are still speaking out, and as long as that continues, there's always a possibility, no matter how small, that something could change. Until then, this remains one of hip-hop's most debated cases. And now the question is yours. Do you think he's innocent? Or did the system get it right? Now I want to hear from you because this is one of those cases where there's no easy answer and your perspective actually matters more than ever. After hearing everything about C. Murder, the rise, the conviction, the recanted witnesses, the non-unanimous jury, and the fact that he's still behind bars, where do you stand? Do you believe this is a wrongful conviction that deserves a new trial? Or do you think the courts have already made the right decision and the verdict should stay exactly as it is? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is one of those conversations where every opinion adds another layer to the story, and trust me, people are split right down the middle on this. If you found this breakdown helpful and you want more deep dives like this, where we go beyond the viral headlines and actually separate facts from rumors, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. Because stories like this don't just end, they evolve. And when they do, we'll be right here breaking it all down step by step.